Welcome to Crime Pulse Stories. I'm your narrator, guiding you through a case that forever altered the lives of five teenagers and shook New York City to its core. It all began on a brisk April evening in the year 1989, one of the tensest periods in the city's recent history, marked by soaring crime rates and an undercurrent of racial tension. Central Park, bustling by day with dog walkers, bicyclists, and families, became a dark expanse of shadows at nightfall. Sometime after 9 o'clock, a young investment banker named Trisha Meili went for a routine jog along the park's winding paths. Those who knew her described Meili as determined and disciplined, a person who enjoyed running as part of her rigorous fitness regimen. Little did anyone know that her evening run would soon spark one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history. At around 1 in the morning, Meili was found near the 102nd Street Transverse, barely clinging to life, an event that would soon become front-page news across the nation. As dawn broke, the gravity of the assault fully came to light. Meili had been found beaten, bound, and left unconscious. Her clothing was torn, and there were ominous trails of blood leading away from the site of the attack. Emergency responders rushed her to the Metropolitan Hospital Center. Doctors fought desperately to save her life. In the ensuing chaos, the New York City Police Department locked down the crime scene to search for any clue, footprints, personal belongings, or signs of a struggle that might identify a culprit. By the first morning news cycle, word of the brutal attack exploded across radio stations and television broadcasts. The city, already gripped by fear from a wave of violent crime, demanded swift action. Under immense pressure, investigators began rounding up suspects who had been in or around Central Park that night. Within hours, five teenagers, quickly dubbed by the media as the Central Park Five, were taken into custody. Authorities claimed the young suspects had been wilding in the park, attacking joggers and cyclists. The narrative sets in almost immediately. These five teenagers were to blame, and the city would see them punished. Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Korey Wise were all in their teens, some as young as 14, when they were suddenly thrust into the glaring spotlight of a case that would define their lives. Their families lived in Harlem and other parts of uptown Manhattan, neighborhoods grappling with poverty and limited resources. Each boy came from a different personal background. Some lived with single parents, others had multiple siblings, but all shared the hope of a brighter future despite their challenging circumstances. Almost overnight, these five teenagers found themselves depicted as a vicious wolf pack in the press. Headlines called them marauding gang members. Tabloids reveled in sensational stories of rampaging youths. Politicians joined in with demands for stiffer penalties for juvenile offenders, tapping into a growing racial and social divide in the city. As tensions reached a boiling point, few stopped to ask for evidence beyond the boys' forced confessions. Fear had taken hold of New York City, and it was easy for many to believe that the Central Park Five were the embodiment of the city's worst nightmares. Little did the public know, the real story of that night was far more complex and would, in time, unveil a grave miscarriage of justice. As these five young suspects were led away in handcuffs, their families and neighbors could only watch in horror, fearing the system would forever change and possibly destroy the lives of their children. As the news of the Central Park attack spread, local tabloids and national outlets seized on the story, amplifying every grim detail. The year was 1989, a time when New York City was already battling a significant rise in violent crime, and the public mood was volatile. The press quickly labeled the suspects a wolf pack, stoking racial and class tensions. Headlines decried the moral decay of urban youth, and talk radio shows buzzed with calls for harsher punishments and a return to law and order. Politicians, too, weighed in. Some demanded that the teenagers be tried as adults, reflecting a broader fear that juvenile justice was too lenient. Under this intense public scrutiny, detectives and prosecutors felt their reputations on the line. Every newscast, every front-page article magnified the stakes of the case. It was in this firestorm of moral panic that the seeds for potential injustice were planted, because in the rush to indict, the priority became tying up loose ends rather than verifying evidence. Behind closed doors at the precinct, the 5 suspects found themselves thrust into a situation most adults would struggle to navigate: grueling, extended interrogations. Police officers questioned them repeatedly without consistent legal representation or parental guidance. Sleep-deprived, scared, and confronted with leading questions, the boys struggled to maintain their innocence in the face of relentless pressure. In those cramped rooms, investigators urged each teenager to say something, anything that would wrap up the case. The interrogations dragged on for hours, in some cases overnight. Separated from one another, the boys were told that their friends had already confessed, adding to the confusion. Ultimately, each suspect gave a taped statement, but their stories varied in critical ways. Some named the others as the prime attackers, some claimed not to have witnessed the assault at all. Yet, for the authorities, the existence of recorded confessions, regardless of the contradictions within them, was enough to move forward. As far as the public and much of the media were concerned, the boys had not only implicated themselves, but also confirmed a terrifying narrative about roving teenage gangs in Central Park. Almost from the start, pieces of the puzzle simply did not fit. The times and locations the teenagers described were inconsistent with the actual timeline of the attack on Trisha Meili. Even the most basic details, like which path they were supposed to have taken, didn't line up. Some teenagers retracted or changed their statements, claiming detectives had fed them certain elements of the story. Despite these glaring red flags, the city was in no mood to second-guess the police. New Yorkers, fearful of escalating crime, desperately wanted a measure of closure and a sense of order restored. Elected officials touted the arrests as proof that the system was working. However, behind the scenes, the families of the 5 teenagers were sounding the alarm. They protested that their children had been intimidated, coerced, or tricked into making false statements. The parents and guardians questioned how a group of frightened kids, some of whom had never spent a single night away from home, could navigate an interrogation by seasoned detectives. Their concerns fell largely on deaf ears. As the case moved forward, each new day brought the 5 one step closer to trial and deeper into a nightmare they could never have imagined. The trials that followed were a spectacle of raw emotion and relentless accusation. Split into 2 separate proceedings in the year 1990, they drew in throngs of reporters and a public already fixated on the confessions. Prosecutors showcased these videotaped admissions as the centerpiece of their case, stitching together a patchwork narrative of how the 5 teenagers supposedly attacked Trisha Meili. But observers who looked closer noticed glaring contradictions. Timelines didn't match, and specific details of the assault changed from confession to confession. The defense teams pushed back, underscoring the absence of physical evidence. No DNA from any of the teenagers was found at the crime scene, and Trisha Meili herself had no recollection of the attack due to her injuries. They called forensic experts to testify that the crime scene suggested only one assailant, not multiple. Despite this, the court of public opinion had already made up its mind. Nightly newscasts continued to paint the 5 as remorseless predators, stoking fear and anger. Jurors, swept up in the emotion of the moment and guided by the taped confessions, ultimately looked past the tangled threads of the prosecution's story, bringing the proceedings to a tense close. The verdicts landed with the force of a hammer blow. Each of the Central Park 5, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Korey Wise, was found guilty on various charges, including assault, robbery, and attempted murder. For many New Yorkers, the convictions felt like a measure of relief from the city's broader crime epidemic. Newspapers splashed headlines proclaiming justice served. but for anyone paying attention to the inconsistencies, a deeper sense of unease set in. One by one, as the judge pronounced sentences, the teenagers stood in stunned disbelief. Kevin, Raymond, Antron, and Yusef, still minors, received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years in juvenile detention, followed by possible transfers to adult facilities. Korey, who was 16, was sentenced as an adult, an especially severe blow that would send him directly into the harsh adult prison system. Even as the public cheered, unanswered questions remained. Why didn't the DNA evidence match any of the five? Why were the alleged roles of each teenager so different from confession to confession? These doubts would smolder beneath the surface for over a decade. In the months after their convictions, the Central Park Five began a stark new chapter of life, serving time in juvenile facilities and adult prisons. Kevin, Raymond, Antron, and Yusef were initially placed into youth institutions where they grappled with regimented schedules, minimal freedoms, and the looming reality that they might be transferred to adult prisons once they aged out. Their families clung to hope, rallying around their sons and vowing to fight for exoneration. They took to the streets, speaking out about coerced confessions and a rushed investigation, determined that the world should not forget these boys. Korey Wise faced an even harsher reality. Tried and sentenced as an adult, he was sent directly to facilities like Rikers Island, where he confronted violence, intimidation, and isolation on a daily basis. Younger and smaller than many of the inmates, Korey found himself in an unrelenting battle for survival. Rumors of innocence did little to shield him from the brutalities of incarceration. Yet, through the passing years, all five worked to maintain their dignity. Letters from home became lifelines. Occasional visits from family members and friends offered flickers of normalcy. And somehow, despite the overwhelming weight of their convictions, each teenager turned adult held onto a distant hope that the facts would emerge, the truth would be recognized, and one day they would walk free. Matias Reyes' confession, offered in the year 2002, shook the very foundations of the Central Park case. He revealed in disturbing detail how he alone had attacked Trisha Meili on that spring night in 1989. Initially, his admission was met with deep skepticism. After all, Reyes had a record of vicious crimes and might have sought to manipulate the system for unknown reasons. Still, investigators felt compelled to verify his story with modern forensics. When the DNA results returned, the findings were unequivocal. The genetic material from the crime scene matched Reyes, not the Central Park Five. This revelation left prosecutors, the police, and the public reeling. How could five young men have been found guilty of a crime they did not commit? As the news broke, it set off a chain reaction that would eventually force the justice system to confront its own failures. For the Central Park Five, now grown men serving out sentences or trying to rebuild their lives after incarceration, Reyes' confession felt surreal. Everything they had been saying for years, that their videotaped admissions were coerced and riddled with inconsistencies, was finally validated by scientific evidence. It also reignited questions about the original investigation. Why had DNA exonerating them been ignored or dismissed? How could such a critical piece of forensic proof have been cast aside in favor of forced confessions? Prosecutors had no choice but to revisit the original proceedings. Within the corridors of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, staff pored over evidence files, interrogation tapes, and trial transcripts. The chilling truth emerged: key components of the prosecution's case simply did not stand up to scrutiny. Publicly, officials were forced to admit the unthinkable, that the wrong people had been punished and a dangerous criminal had gone free for over a decade. Armed with undeniable DNA proof and Reyes' confession, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office took the extraordinary step of recommending the complete vacating of all convictions against the Central Park Five. For Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Korey Wise, each of whom had lost the prime years of adolescence and early adulthood. The legal victory was a bittersweet moment. They were finally free of the stigma and constraints of being labeled violent felons, yet the damage was irreparable. Outside the courthouse, as cameras flashed, the five men spoke candidly about their relief and anger. They had endured everything from shattered family relationships to the trauma of prison life. In the public eye, they quickly became symbols of how the justice system can fail so profoundly and how critical it is to fight for accountability. Their case challenged the reliability of confessions obtained under intense pressure, the unchecked power of media narratives, and the deep-seated biases that can convict the innocent while allowing the real perpetrator to walk free for years. News of the exoneration raced through New York City and far beyond, igniting fierce debates about systemic racism, flawed police tactics, and the potent influence of the media. Questions arose about the detectives who had pursued the case with tunnel vision. Why had they ignored glaring contradictions? Were they driven by public pressure, prejudice, or both? Many demanded accountability, pointing to prosecutors who built their arguments around coerced confessions rather than physical evidence. Journalists also came under fire for depicting the teenagers as a vicious wolf pack before a shred of evidence was properly tested. Demonstrators gathered outside government buildings and media headquarters, brandishing signs that read, "Justice for the Central Park Five" and "Stop Racial Profiling." Soon, the case wasn't just a local controversy, it became a nationwide symbol of wrongful convictions and entrenched bias. Elected officials who had once advocated for tougher penalties on the five now faced uneasy questions about their own roles in fanning the flames of public outrage. Adjusting to life as free men proved a daunting challenge for the exonerated five. During their most formative years, they had missed proms, high school graduations, and everyday teenage milestones most people take for granted. Upon release, they found a changed city, new technologies, altered social landscapes, and opportunities that had long passed them by. Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Korey Wise each navigated a unique path to rebuild what remained of their futures. Some struggled with finding steady employment due to their wrongful criminal records even after exoneration. Family relationships, strained by the trauma of incarceration and public shame, required healing over time. Though the city later reached a settlement worth tens of millions of dollars with the men, no amount of money could truly restore the youth they had lost. In spite of these challenges, the Central Park Five emerged as passionate voices in the fight against injustice. They spoke at universities, joined forums on criminal justice reform, and advocated for the rights of the wrongly accused. Their harrowing ordeal served as a testament to the real-life consequences of a broken system and to the resilience it takes to overcome it. The Central Park Five case sent ripples through the legal world, sparking a broader discussion about how investigations are conducted and confessions are obtained. Civil liberties organizations held it up as a pivotal example of the dangers of coercive interrogations, especially for juveniles who often do not fully understand their rights. State legislatures around the country began to consider bills requiring the videotaping of entire interrogations, not merely the final confessions. These reforms aimed to ensure that judges and juries could see how statements were elicited, reducing the risk of false admissions made under fear or confusion. Meanwhile, advances in DNA technology spurred calls for re-examinations of older cases, particularly those hinging on questionable confessions. Defense attorneys, emboldened by the undeniable proof of wrongful convictions, pressed for more stringent protocols in preserving crime scene evidence. Educators in law schools and police academies started citing the Central Park Five as a cautionary tale, demonstrating how a perfect storm of flawed investigations, media frenzy, and societal biases can derail justice. In the end, the tragedy that befell Kevin, Raymond, Antron, Yusef, and Korey forced an entire nation to confront uncomfortable truths. Their story fundamentally reshaped public perception of both policing and prosecutions, serving as a stark warning of what can happen when the pursuit of a quick resolution eclipses the pursuit of the truth. Even with the exonerations and the revelations about Matias Reyes' sole responsibility, a haunting question remains: how could a major city let 5 teenagers be locked away for a crime they never committed? Some point to systemic biases, racial and social prejudices that made it easier for the public to believe the worst about young men of color. Others blame a media frenzy so intense that sensational headlines overshadowed any semblance of balanced reporting. Still more blame the justice system's focus on quick resolutions over thorough investigations, especially in a city reeling from skyrocketing crime rates. Critical DNA inconsistencies were either overlooked or dismissed at trial, revealing a disturbing truth about the power of coerced confessions and the allure of a closed case. The relentless drive to reassure the public that justice had been done allowed deep cracks in the system to go unexamined. The Central Park Five remain a stark reminder that flawed investigations can profoundly upend innocent lives, especially when fear, prejudice, and sensational journalism collide. In closing, the ordeal of Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Korey Wise serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Their wrongful convictions stand as a testament to what can happen when a community, in its quest for swift justice, is blinded by fear and bias. These young men lost precious years, moments that should have been filled with discovery, growth, and the boundless possibilities of youth. As we conclude this episode of Crime Pulse Stories, I invite you to reflect. Could this have been prevented through fairer interrogation methods? How did public sentiment, stoked by relentless media coverage, shape the outcome of the trial? And most crucially, how can we, as a society, ensure that an innocent person is never again condemned for someone else's crime? Thank you for joining me on this profound journey of discovery and reckoning. Let us continue to examine the darkest corners of our justice system and shine a light on every oversight until the truth can no longer be ignored.